Hey viewers, my name's Cara. Welcome to February. Happy February 2021. I didn't know what I wanted to talk about this week, so I wanted to pick something that could be fairly quick, and I thought, what's fairly quick to tell you about, but that I, of course, can stretch into a whole video, that is somewhat news right now. And the first thing that came to mind was something about the tradition of witchcraft that I am involved in, something about reclaiming witchcraft. This is a book by Iris Anya Moon, which is about the tradition and how it functions. I did a video about this book already. One of the things in this book, which just came out in the summer of 2020, is already outdated. Let me explain why. There is a document that it's sort of a statement of shared beliefs and values of the reclaiming tradition, which is a worldwide tradition in the sense that there are reclaiming witches in many places all around the world. I won't say everywhere in the world because we're not everywhere in the world, but there are pockets of reclaiming community all around the world. Australia, Europe, South America, North America. And so there is this document. It's called the Principles of Unity, and it is a statement, as I said, about the shared beliefs and values of the entire tradition. Now, it's kind of hard to make any type of statement that applies to such a big, diverse group, and that is why this document has actually been updated before. It's a growing, changing, living document, and it was just updated again most recently at the end of January 2021. So I want to tell you a little bit about that because I was able to somewhat take part in the process. The Principles of Unity, which are printed as they were when this book was published in summer of 2020, in chapter 2. Chapter 2 of this book is titled Principles of Unity / Beliefs, and it has the text as it was right there. So there's essentially 7 paragraphs to this document, and it is only the 5th paragraph that just got updated this time around. There was another time that it got updated in 2012 where some languaging around gender and the gender of deity or lack of gender of deity in the way that we interact with mystery and the divine was updated. That change took a long time to get made from my understanding. I was not involved in the tradition at that point, or I had sort of just started learning about it at that point. So the first iteration of the Principles of Unity that I actually came across, I think, was that updated version. So I was not familiar with the original that was agreed upon by the members of Reclaiming in the late 1990s. But I was more involved this time around. So what happened was, due to the pandemic, there could not be in-person gatherings, as is the case for everybody. And so decisions like this, big tradition-wide decisions and changes, usually would be made at events where people have gathered in person, have sent representatives from their communities. Of course, this means people would have had to travel there, and so it's a little limiting in that sense. So because of the pandemic, nobody was doing that. But instead of just not making any changes and not having any meetings, a lot more things were being done online. That, of course, is also limiting because not everybody has access to the technology or knew how to use the technology, but a lot of people have been able to learn or join with other people in their family who know how, and so a lot of other people have been able to participate in these things who would not have otherwise been able to because traveling to an in-person event once a year or every other year or whatever was inaccessible for them. So none of these ways of going about things is completely perfect for everyone because technology is inaccessible for some people, travel is inaccessible for others, but it did allow for us to be able to sort of streamline some things and make sure that important decisions, important conversations, important discussions were still being had so that then important decisions could be made on a quicker schedule. Because typically these events that are happening in person, as I just said, they would only happen once a year or maybe every other year. So decisions usually that would have to be made at these events, you might have a discussion at one of those events, but then say, okay, now let's take the next couple of years to go back to our communities and discuss these things further, we'll come back at the next meeting in 2 years to make the final decision. So a lot of these decisions take a very long time. Reclaiming is also a tradition that uses consensus process, meaning that we have to reach consensus on these decisions. It's not just something that you vote and majority rules. The goal is really to consensus upon these decisions, to reach consensus. That is stuff that Iris Anya also talks about in this book. So again, if you want to know more about how the tradition actually functions, how it operates, this book is great for that. Anyway, with it being online, however, we were able to have some opening discussions online last year, and the first sort of round of these discussions came about in September of 2020 after the DARC Council, DARC, which stands for Decolonizing Actions in Reclaiming Communities, put together some proposed changes to this one specific paragraph of the Principles of Unity. We needed some updated language, and it was concerning things like the fact that we are an activist tradition, social justice oriented tradition, and so there was some languaging in the Principles of Unity that had to do with harm and nonviolence and peace and all of these types of things. And so throughout the last year, this is of course something that a lot of us have been talking about. What are the methods that we use toward social justice? And there have been lots of people who have very strong opinions about how certain people should or should not fight for their own rights and freedoms and to protect themselves and their loved ones, and what we as allies or accomplices or friends and family of these people, of any people, should or should not get behind as methods that we okay for other people to do, right? Like, this is a very, very big conversation. And so the DARC Council put together a proposal of how we could update the language to better reflect the way that the tradition feels about allowing people to come up with their own methods for fighting for their own rights and freedoms, and that we don't get to tell other people how to defend themselves, how to fight for themselves. We can choose to support them or not, but we don't really get to dictate how oppressed people, historically oppressed people, get to be angry about that and fight for their rights, essentially. So the proposed language was shared. We had an initial round of meetings about it online in September, some of which were like chat room, text-based, where anybody within the tradition who wanted to be a part of that could sign up as a participant. So that's what I did. I participated in that kind of asynchronous discussion where it was open for a week or something like that, and people could talk, ask questions, share concerns, things like that. And then communities were able to select representatives to send to a live meeting that would be taking place on Zoom. It was just easier that way because having only a certain number of representatives from multiple communities, of course, meant there were fewer people having time to speak in a live Zoom type of environment. So what happened was all of us were able to kind of talk within our own communities or talk within this online discussion that had been facilitated, whether you're part of a community or not, because a lot of us are not part of existing communities because we are not everywhere all around the world. People were able to have those discussions, and then the representatives could see basically what does my home community or my wider camp community or just the people that I'm connected to within the tradition, what do they think about it? And then those representatives were able to take those concerns or agreements, whatever it was, to that live meeting. I am growing community in my state, but it's not that big of a community yet, so I didn't feel like I needed to be a community representative for my community. I am very closely tied into the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania community because they are the closest to me geographically, so I've done a lot of work with them in person pre-COVID. So I actually just kind of felt like for the purposes of this wider community decision-making thing, I would just kind of fold into that. So the Pittsburgh representatives were kind of my representatives and my community's representatives, because there's not a whole lot of us yet in my state, but we're growing, so maybe in the future we will have enough people to select our own representatives to go to a Birch Council meeting. That's what it's called. Birch stands for Broader Intra-Reclaiming Council of Hubs. It's also explained in the Pagan Portals Reclaiming Witchcraft book. But anyway, so I participated in the kind of chat discussion area of it and speaking with our community representatives to make sure that they kind of had an idea of what we all thought, but then the community reps went to that live meeting. And for the September meeting, it was not a decision-making meeting. We knew the decision is not going to be made right now. It was just a discussion meeting to really get an idea of people's thoughts, concerns, feelings, whatever. Because there was some language that had been proposed to be removed from the Principles of Unity that some people really felt strongly about wanting to keep. And so we were having discussions about why is that language no longer relevant? Why does that no longer suit who we are as a tradition and as a community? And why we wanted to alter certain things, add certain things, and remove other things. It really could have been that whatever the Dark Council had proposed could just be agreed upon as is, or there could be some wordsmithing done. There could be some alterations made to the proposed language to make it something that we could reach consensus on. So that's kind of what this whole process was. After those September meetings, the information that we had at that point and the proposal as it stood at that point was again shared with everybody to make sure that we could all talk about it with our home communities and everything like that. Some people hosted events with their home community to be able to have discussions with them. And again, all of this was happening online because this is this past year during a pandemic. So some people were having those types of discussions in their online spaces with their own communities. My community, as I said, was not that big, so I didn't host any type of event or something like that, but I shared it in the space where I talk to the people who are sort of already connected with my small growing community, and allowed people the chance to read through it and then let me know if they had any concerns about it. And everybody who had anything to say about it, we were all just like, I like it the way it is. I am in favor of this. I would vote for this exactly the way it is. I would also be okay if the language was changed slightly, as long as it, has this same overall meaning. We're good with it. We like it. So there wasn't a whole lot that we really had to discuss. We were all quite in favor of it. But in the wider community, there was quite a bit of discussion. Especially, like I said, there was some language that we wanted to remove that some people felt really attached to. There was also some discussion that was required because of the fact that we are a worldwide tradition. Not everybody is used to reading the Principles of Unity in English. A lot of people were reading translations. And so the actual words that they were reading might not have necessarily been the same words that we were reading as English speakers and readers. Even if they were the same words, they might have a different connotation in non-English languages and cultures. So that was really interesting to me, is that there was discussion around things like, what is this sentence actually saying? Because some people had said until they read the English version of the document, they didn't actually realize that it was saying that exactly, because the translation makes it seem like it's slightly different, so there were a lot of these types of discussions that had to be had in order to make sure we knew what we were even talking about and trying to agree on. So after all of that discussion happened, the next round of meetings about this, which would then be the decision-making meeting, finally occurred in January of 2021. And it was the same basic setup where there was a week of chatting online about the topic. And then there was time for a live Zoom discussion at which community representatives spoke on behalf of their communities. And at the end of that process in January, it was agreed upon the new 5th paragraph. So that happened. It was officially consensus upon January 30th, 2021. And I'm going to read you now that new paragraph. I have it up on my screen here because, as I said, it is not in this book. So that is an aspect of this book that is already outdated, and that is a good thing because this is a constantly growing, evolving, and changing tradition, as are many traditions. So it's just one example of how quickly changes can be made, also when things can happen online and not every 2 years when we have to go to an in-person gathering event, right? Without further ado, the newly consensus upon current version of the 5th paragraph of the Reclaiming Tradition Principles of Unity reads as follows. Our tradition honors the wild and calls for service to earth and the community. We work in diverse ways, including nonviolent direct action for all forms of justice: environmental, social, political, racial, gender, and economic. We are an anti-racist tradition that strives to uplift and center BIPOC voices, Black, Indigenous, people of color. Our feminism includes a radical analysis of power, seeing all systems of oppression as interrelated, rooted in structures of domination and control. That first sentence and the last sentence there were unchanged. Those were already in the 5th paragraph. The second sentence had been reworded with a portion removed, and then the rest just kind of wordsmithed a little bit. And then the third sentence there, if I'm counting this correctly, the third sentence, which begins, "We are an anti-racist tradition," is brand new. What is now the second sentence actually takes the place of what used to be the second and third sentence. It removed a portion and changed the wording of the rest. So it used to read, "We value peace and practice nonviolence in keeping with the read, harm none and do what ye will. We work for all forms of justice, environmental, social, political, racial, gender, and economic." Like I said, we were talking about words like peace and nonviolence, and the original text included this quote from the Read, which many people think of as the Wiccan Read. And I feel like this is one of the reasons that over the decades, people have assumed reclaiming is a Wiccan tradition, and it is not. But it makes sense that you would think it is if the Read is being mentioned. And historically, throughout the years, other books and other authors have referred to reclaiming as another tradition of Wicca. It absolutely has some roots in Wicca, as many, many things do, whether they think they do or not. Wicca has really influenced a lot of things. And many of the people who started the tradition that is now known as reclaiming, it wasn't started with the idea that this is a separate tradition of witchcraft, but a lot of those people who were initially involved in what became the reclaiming tradition did have Wiccan influences, and some of them might even have been Wiccan initiates or students of Wiccan traditions. So that's definitely part of the history. It's definitely in the roots of the tree that is this tradition. But as it stands today, it is not considered a Wiccan tradition in and of itself. So that's one of the reasons why I really supported removing that mention, because I come across a lot of people who assume that reclaiming is another traditional Wicca type of branch, and I feel like that's a very confusing assumption to make in many cases. Like I said, we do have some similarities. There's definitely some similarities in how we work. But there are also a lot of differences. And so I feel like it is most helpful that that was removed for that reason, just the association of it being the Wiccan Read reason. But also, there are incredibly nuanced discussions happening all the time about what constitutes harm, And so when we were talking about things like direct action, some people would argue that certain things that groups choose to do to fight for their rights and protest and whatever they're doing, some people argue that that's causing harm. It says in our principles that we harm none. And so we just realized this isn't really necessarily something that it's fair to say is applicable for every person associated with this tradition, with as diverse as a tradition as we want to be. And that doesn't mean that individual people who are part of the tradition cannot personally abide by the guidance of the Read. It doesn't mean that you can't follow that. What it says by removing it from the tradition-wide document, in my opinion, is it's just saying we do not have a presumption that everyone agrees on that point. You can still believe that or not. And so that's also why there was some wordsmithing involved in figuring out how to word the next part, which ended up being, "We work in diverse ways, including nonviolent direct action for all forms of justice." Because the fact that direct action is in there and nonviolent direct action is in there seemed really important to a lot of people, because that is something that this tradition was founded on. It is an activist tradition. The people who founded it were doing nonviolent direct action. That's how a lot of them met. That's a lot of the initial first big magical workings that these people did together. So it did feel important to a significant portion of people that remain in here somehow, and that's how it ended up being worked in. We work in diverse ways, including nonviolent direct action. So just as a way to, again, say that this is not the only way we work, this is not the only method to fight for social justice. And then, as I mentioned, the next sentence, we are an anti-racist tradition that strives to uplift and center BIPOC voices, Black, Indigenous people of color. That is new. Black, Indigenous people of color is in parentheses, by the way. It just says capital letters BIPOC, which we say BIPOC, and then in parentheses it explains what that stands for. That's actually how it's formatted in the new Principles of Unity as they are written. So that's a new big thing that happened in the tradition that I'm involved with. And these are very interesting processes for me to begin being a part of, because I've been sort of somewhat interested in and involved with this tradition for 5 years now, but not always to this extent. And so I feel like, and to this extent, like I'm not even a representative, but even just getting to start being part of some of these conversations and finding out how these processes work, which again is stuff that you can read about in this book as well, but really being able to be part of some of these meetings. I am now a member of various cells for different things, and I may or may not be joining other ones in the future. Oh, I definitely will be in the future, but in the near future, I may or may not be joining some other ones. So it's a very different way of being involved in magical community, and I'm very grateful that I have been able to participate in these ways, which again, for me, it just happens to be more accessible that we can do these things online, because I cannot necessarily travel to these events every year or every other year, whatever the case may be. So if they were always just in-person events, I don't know that I necessarily would ever be able to get to these types of things. That's why the community representative type format is good, because I can always just talk to whoever is going to go to the event to represent us, to make sure that if I do have anything big that I want said or taken into account, that I speak with my representative and they get to speak on my behalf, so I don't have to be there. But it's even easier when it's online, and so that's also a reason that it was able to happen so much more quickly. From September 2020 to January 2021. Decisions don't usually get made that quickly, and so that was a very good thing that we were kind of able to take out of, unfortunately, being forced to do things online instead. And so what a lot of us are hoping is that this can now always kind of be included, even when we get back to being able to do events in person, that maybe we have an online element where somebody has a computer set up along the side to be live broadcasting it to other people who couldn't be there, who want to listen in on the discussion. And that's what we got to do in September. I didn't do that in January. I don't even know if it was an option, because it was just so not on my radar. I had other stuff going on at the time. But at that point, I didn't have anything else to add. I was like, I'm okay with it as it is. I would vote to do it exactly as the Decolonizing Actions and Reclaiming Communities Council proposed it. So, I was like, it's up to you all. I trust you to do what needs done at that point. But we did have the option to listen in to the live discussion that was happening in September. And that's just really cool. And also, like, the notes are made available online for, big tradition-wide meetings, that I can even go online and read the notes for discussions that have happened at previous Birch Council decision-making meetings at the biannual or whatever dandelion gatherings of years past. It's just such a cool thing, realizing that I have the option to go back and see that process in a transparent way and being able to be part of it now. And that is an aspect of my personal path and practice that I have not gotten to speak to you about at all before this point. So I thought this would be a good thing to share with you in this video, because I don't talk a whole lot about that, because it is, I'm not a representative of the entire reclaiming community ever. But of course, anytime I get on the internet and say I'm a reclaiming witch, and then other words come out of my mouth, those words that then come out of my mouth can be associated with the tradition that I just said I'm a part of, so and that's always been the case of being on the internet, is that it's this constant awareness that I only speak for myself, and I should really only ever attempt to speak for myself, because I can't speak for other people and their personal experiences and backgrounds and anything like that. But also knowing that just by virtue of speaking to people, I will also be seen as a representative for any of the other identities I hold or groups that I say that I am a part of. And that is a really powerful paradox that I think we all have always had to contend with. But I very much feel that when I talk about things like reclaiming, because I am aware of how new I am to it relatively. I've been involved with it for 5 years in one way or another, but still have, nowhere, not even scratched the surface. I have some other news for you while we're here, actually. I will be able to tell you much more about this in the near future because it hasn't been officially announced yet. I still have another meeting before that's going to happen. But the next big thing for me as a milestone of my involvement with this tradition and my sort of personal goals, I've been speaking somewhat vaguely over the past few years about the fact that I am in the process of becoming a trained teacher in the reclaiming tradition. And I have now taken most of my core classes, and I decided to reach out to my community and let them know I'm ready to begin student teaching. So this spring, I will be student teaching a core class of the reclaiming tradition online. It'll be an online class, and I am assisting, or I'm working with 2 co-teachers who will be the main teachers. All reclaiming classes are co-taught by 2 or more teachers in order to model shared power, and that no one person has all the answers, and so we're always getting different perspectives and things like that. And so I am student teaching with 2 other co-teachers. We had our first meeting about it last month. I've got another meeting about it coming up this weekend, and I believe after that we will be officially announcing it. We'll be able to tell you when registration is going to open and all other kinds of fun stuff about that. So you will be hearing more about that from me later on, probably later on this month. But I just thought I would mention it here since it is a reclaiming related thing, and that is my other reclaiming tradition related news. So that's it. That's the news. That's what I wanted to let you know about today. The principles of unity have been updated, and also this is certainly not the only update that we feel like needs made. And now that this one has been made, a lot of people are already starting to talk about, okay, what can we update and evolve next? Because there are other things that we feel like can be more brought into how we feel today. So this is definitely not the final form, right? So it's very interesting, very cool, and thought you might be interested in hearing about it. So thank you very much for watching and or listening to this video. I will see you next time, and until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye. I highly recommend the Pagan Portals Reclaiming Witchcraft book by Ira Sonia Moon. Again, if you want to know how reclaiming functions as a tradition, as a community, that's what this book is. It is not a how to be a witch book. It is about much more process and detail.